Roadside. Thank you for tuning in. Just about 3 minutes after 9 o'clock. Beautiful looking Wednesday morning. I hope you're doing well. You know, we have an interesting topic to discuss right now, and it is the topic of what we as Americans do when somebody that we love has passed away, has died. And if, in fact, even the word passed away has been questioned. We had a Catholic priest in here one day, and he was kind of chastising us, I guess, in a friendly way, for using the expression passed away. He said, no, they died. Passed away and died is two different things in his world. I hate saying died, I'll be honest with you. I can remember as when I was much younger, I guess one of my grandparents had died, and I remember asking the funeral director, or at least an employee at the funeral home, why do you think we do this? Why do you think we lay the body out so that we can look at it for a while? And his answer was that we do this so that we believe that the person is gone. Because if somebody dies and you don't view the body, you might not believe the person is gone. And I've known some people who've died that were either cremated or were of a faith where they didn't do anything like that. And it did sort of kind of feel like maybe they made a mistake. Maybe the person didn't really die. It's kind of crazy, I know. But anyway, we have some interesting customs and maybe even in particular to our own families. I remember when I guess it was my mom who passed away, and there were so many young children in my family, and they were all at the funeral, and they were very playful. They were running around, and there was my mom's lifeless body lying in the coffin. And even in the coffin is an interesting phenomenon. I mean, it's almost like a Cadillac. It looks like a vehicle. Yeah. You know, but the children were running around, and I remember thinking, gosh, I hope people who are coming to the funeral understand that this is what she would have wanted. Yeah. She would have wanted children, and that's usually, I guess, the ultimate answer for all these things. Kate Sweeney has written about this and explored this in ways I'd be afraid to explore this topic, to be honest. She does a radio show, by the way. She's on NPR in Atlanta. I guess the station's WABE. Is that right? Yes. She's the recipient of 3 Edward R. Murrow Awards. How awesome is that? A number of Associated Press Awards. She's a contributor to the Oxford American, Atlanta Magazine, New South, and an award-winning author, and it's obvious why. American Afterlife is the title of her book, Encounters in the Customs of Mourning. And one of the reviews I read said, and I'll have to paraphrase it, people will love this book to death. Kind of a fun way of talking about a book with a serious but so interesting topic. Good morning, Kate. Thank you for being on the air with us today. Kate Sweeney.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for that glowing introduction. I don't know if you can feel me blushing all the way here from Atlanta.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. That's nice. What was the genesis of the idea for the book?
That is a great question. I mean, a lot of people have asked me, why would a nice young woman like you be writing about death? Why on earth would you do this? And, when I started the book, I was in my late 20s. There I was in my late 20s, early 30s. And to be honest with you, it began as just sort of a nerdy interest, because if there's any topic in the world that is full of sort of very little known facts, it is memorialization, past and present, because I quickly became a really great person at dinner parties because I could talk about, the history of, as you said, coffins and caskets, how coffins became caskets in the United States, and everything that goes into putting a funeral together, down to that piece of green astroturf that surrounds the grave, and the history of embalming fluid and all that kind of thing, which is actually a lot of fun, and I had a lot of fun with it in the book. But, I think another reason that I wrote the book is I was maybe sort of trying to prepare myself a little bit about what I could expect once loss happened to me, because it had not yet happened to me at that point in my life, not in a real way.
Okay, and has it since? It's kind of a personal question, but...
I've lost 2 grandmothers, but... I would say those were expected losses, not really sort of catastrophic. Yeah.
Well, and having been to funerals of young people as well as people who've lived their lives, there is a different feeling.
Absolutely.
Obviously, it depends on why that person died sometimes.
Absolutely. But, actually, I'm going to say it's interesting that you were saying sort of in the introduction about children running around your mother's casket. I had
Right.
a really sort of similar experience. When I was putting the book together, I went out on a boat with a group of families who'd had their loved ones' ashes made into artificial coral reefs, and were jettisoning those to the bottom of the sea.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, and we were all out there for a military salute the day before we got on the boat, and there were a bunch of kids or grown children of a man who had died, sort of the family patriarch, and his artificial coral reef was sitting there. And if you imagine this thing, it's about the size of an ottoman, a footrest with a bunch of holes in it, and it's made of sort of the cement compound. And all the grandchildren were running around it, and then they started climbing all over it. And this is an artificial coral reef, literally composed of their grandpa's ashes. And you sort of saw their parents sort of hesitate as if, maybe they shouldn't be doing this. But then they let them, they allowed them, and it was sort of this joyful moment. Because the kids clambered all over him in life, and, why not now, too?
So I wonder, because as you're talking, I'm remembering another moment, and I won't bore you with my own stories, but it was after the funeral, and we lived near a beautiful river, and I remember a lot of my cousins and I went to this river, and we were playful and having fun, and it was like so contrary to what we had just gone through, and it was almost like you have to get on with life once you know what's, once, I don't know. But so that leads, I guess that leads to the question. I'm wondering because, in my own family, there are certain aspects to a funeral that are clearly dictated by our religion, and I'll just say it that way because I'm guessing everybody's got a slightly variation, or a big variation in their religious beliefs. But in my case, I don't think much of it was really about religion. Most of it was just about us.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of memorials in a big way are about the survivors and those of us who are left here and our needs. And, it's interesting, are sort of talking about the lighthearted along with this sort of, obvious grief that's there as well. As I put the book together, I kept coming across these sort of lighthearted moments, often like right on the feet of something that really, really sad that had happened. I'm thinking, for example, of the family who this woman was talking about how she lost her brother, and he was in his 30s, and he died in a motorcycle accident. It was really sad, and it was tragic. And his family had him buried in a green burial cemetery in South Carolina. And so she was telling me that story, and it was sad, And then she was talking about how every year since they have a memorial weenie roast at his grave at the cemetery. So these moments just sort of kept popping up. It's sort of like, when you find yourself laughing at a funeral and you think, I really shouldn't be doing this. But here I am giggling.
Well, let me ask you about the book itself. So this is what you did. Yeah. You went asking people, and certain stories made it in the book, and some, that's kind of run of the mill. Did you have that happen?
Well, what I did is I went out and I spoke to people who found themselves involved with death and memorialization, sort of on people who were faced with it themselves, and folks who helped to shepherd people through it. So there was a third-generation funeral director. There was a group of obituary writers who were meeting out in the New Mexico desert in a conference. And then it turned out there was a rival obituary writers conference that had just taken place across the country.
Oh, goodness. Really?
Yeah. There was the story of a woman attending a roadside memorial for her daughter, so a chapter all about roadside memorial. The group of folks out on the boat. And what I found that was really fascinating is, a lot of people ask me, were people hesitant to talk to you about this? Because, it can be it is very personal, and it can be difficult to talk about. But what I found was that people are actually really, they do want to talk about this stuff. And often are happy to be asked to tell their stories that they might have sort of felt was sort of a taboo thing to talk about, in normal social situations in the past.
It was very interesting to read that you were a fan of 6 Feet Under, and that was that was a fun show, but it was poignant in itself because that was the house for funeral directors helping people get through their grief, yet when their own dad died, his ghost would always pop up in their imaginations during the episode to try to help them through life while they're helping people through death.
Right. And I think, gosh, I loved that show. I was obsessed with it. And that really is sort of what got the ball rolling. But yeah, I mean, and sort of what you're saying, I think kind of might go to show that there's no one right way to do for grief to happen. You know, it happens differently for everyone, and people memorialize their loved ones differently. You know, I spoke with folks who were very strongly in favor of the traditional, mind you, only in the last 150 years or so, but the quote-unquote traditional funeral in the United States with embalming and you know, the all the cars and the casket and the flowers and everything, and other people who were very, you know, strongly in favor of this new phenomenon of green burial, which is no embalming and nothing that doesn't biodegrade completely, and, you know, other people who were in favor of, you know, cremation and all sorts of things. But everybody's decision, you know, is right for him or her at the time that it happened. So everybody that I talked to, I found his or her story, you know, really compelling. And you asked, how did I decide what got into the book? And it really was just sort of the really most compelling stories that I found.
Oh, really? Well, one of the things that is somewhat controversial are the roadside memorials. You brought them up earlier. And I think in the state of Florida, anyway, I think here I think they're not legal, but nobody touches them for the most part, if I understand it right.
Yeah.
And I think you can ask the Department of Transportation to put up a sign that says drive carefully instead of the cross or the Star of David or whatever you may put there. But I've seen some, like in the National Forest, I've seen some, gosh, they've been there a long time. And so I guess some just don't get messed with, I guess.
Right. That chapter was fascinating because what I found is that this nation really is kind of a patchwork of laws when it comes to roadside memorials. I talked with folks at departments of transportation all over the country. I mean, really, and it is really fascinating because in some states it's legal, but only inside the highway right of way. In other states, it's legal, but it has to be outside the highway right of way.
Oh, wow.
And then in some states you have to get special signs made. And it really sort of came down to that chapter, ended up kind of being a lot about what we're comfortable in terms of memorialization. Because when folks take issue with roadside memorials, it often has to do with, you know, should I have to see your sign of mourning outside of a cemetery or a funeral home? You know, is it okay for me to be driving my kids to their birthday party and see basically your reminder of death, you know, in this place, you know, just sort of on the street rather than in the cemetery? And you see sort of the same debate pop up again and again. I have a Google alert on this, and across the country, you know, you have folks sort of having the same arguments again and again and again. And I think it sort of says a lot about maybe where we stand, where different people stand in terms of their comfort with death, and maybe even where we stand as a country.
When we didn't live as long as we do now, did you explore some of the customs from maybe 100 years ago?
Did I?
Yeah. Okay. Talk about them.
Oh my goodness! This was like one major reason that I was first excited about writing this book, because I thought, I'm going to get to explore hair jewelry. You know, people used to make jewelry out of human hair back in the 1800s, and you know, the people were dying, you know, the death rate was very high back then. People were dying of all sorts of things, from childbirth to dysentery to the Civil War, right?
Right.
And so these mementos became ready-made sort of death mementos once the person had died. And you had things like memorial photography. And I get into all of this in the book. One thing that I found to be particularly telling, though, is this. So the room in the house where funerals used to take place was the parlor, because funerals used to take place at home, and many of your listeners probably know this. But this is really neat. So then around the turn of the 20th century, hospitals began to arise, and standalone funeral businesses began to arise. So people were dying outside of the house for the first time, and death itself was taking place outside of the house because we had the first funeral businesses. Well, the first funeral businesses were named funeral parlors, after that room in the house where funerals had traditionally taken place. Now, I'll also say that the parlor was also the room where you might traditionally, court your sweetheart, sitting on the Davenport.
Isn't that interesting?
And where you might get married as well. So, like, the whole spectrum of human life took place in the parlor. So, but the first standalone funeral businesses were called funeral parlors because funeral directors wanted to gain people's trust. But then, about 10 or 20 years later, when death had moved out of the house, we'd become less familiar with it, and it became a little bit strange to us. We moved for a change in the name of the room in the house called the parlor. It changed from being the parlor to being called the living room.
I never knew that. Wow.
Yeah, I didn't either.
Think about that. Living room, this is a room
that is interesting.
Life,
yes.
not death.
Oh, wow.
So that is just sort of like one small story among many that really, I think, showcase our changing attitude towards death in this country.
Do you know, I had this question, and I guess you, in a way, have answered it now. And it was years ago when I was sitting at a pizza parlor, and I was discussing with a friend. I was saying, why are there only 3 parlors? There's pizza, massage, and funeral.
Yeah.
2 of them are fun.
Yeah.
And the other one starts with fun.
That's right. And also in your book, you really try to talk about the role of the funeral director and his or her staff in there, because they are 2 different people, really, because they have this persona that they need to have when the people need them for their departed loved ones. And then they have their own life, the life of the living with the family.
Right. I don't know if there is a profession in this country that has spent more time trying to gain the public's trust than the funeral director. I mean, if you think about this, you think about the early 20th century when they were first trying to gain people's trust enough to say, okay, we can take care of everything. You don't have to do it at home. We can take care of it for you. Then we have sort of, in 1962, the publication of Jessica Mitford's book, The American Way of Death, which was this muckraking work that uncovered a lot of a lot of sort of wrongdoing in the funeral business at that point in time. And there's been a lot of legislation passed since then. But since that time, funeral directors have spent a lot of time trying to sort of earn back the public's trust, saying, okay, look, you can, being very transparent about what they do. And I mean, if you think about it, their job has always been it's not a job I would want to have because the attention to detail is so important. I mean, people are handing over their loved ones to these people and saying, take care of this person during this final rite of passage. And I don't know if I ever met a set of people with more sort of attention to detail. They're getting called in the middle of the night to go out, and pick up people's loved ones, and then to sort of to present them so that they're really looking their best and and running this show in which absolutely nothing can go wrong. And
right.
I will say, my goodness, that is not a job I would want to have.
Do you know what I noticed one time in the funeral parlor is that the lights over the casket, at least one light is a colored light. And I asked about it, and it's because the skin tone of the deceased person may not look natural without a colored light up there. And the color in the light is determined by the race of the person in the casket.
Oh, wow.
That's interesting.
That is fascinating. I didn't know that. I'm going to add that to my store of knowledge. I mean, you have like this stuff going on, and meanwhile, there's another trend going on for green burial and for home burial.
Home burial? Like in the backyard?
Well, I think
freeze dry.
home funerals. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
When I first started following this trend in like 2007, there were 4 dedicated green or ecologically friendly burial cemeteries in the United States. When I last checked in 2013, there were 40. And so this is a group of folks who is saying, they kind of want to move back to doing things the way that they were done in the 1800s.
Right.
Saying family can take care of all of this. And,
no
embalming.
Going back to the religious part of this, aren't there some religions that just don't believe in embalming because they believe from religious reasons, and I guess they can read, quote something from the Bible or whatever book they use, that says you should bury somebody with their blood or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard that. I don't know it for a fact.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard that?
Yeah. And religion is, as you say, such a key part of people's decision-making process and a lot of these things. My book doesn't get into religious factors as much as other sort of overall cultural factors, but it's true. I mean, there are faiths like the Jewish faith, in which generally, people you go into the ground very quickly. People sit Shiva. And, that kind of thing. Yes, absolutely.
There had been the fashion of mourners and survivors have been affected over the years, too, as to what to wear.
How.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, in the 1800s, when someone died, you pretty much knew, especially for women. I mean, you knew exactly what you were supposed to do, exactly what you were supposed to wear. And those rules of etiquette depended completely on your relationship to the person who had died. So, if you were a widow, for example, you knew you had to wear black, and you couldn't even wear buttons that reflected light for a certain number of months. Mm-hmm. And then usually, your mourning period might be 2 years.
Yeah.
But there were rules for everyone. I mean, down to if you were... Gosh, I read in one etiquette book, if you were the second wife of a man whose first wife's parents died, you were expected to go into mourning. This was like big time mourning culture.
Really?
In the 1800s.
Really?
Yeah.
That makes me question the very definition of the word mourning. I mean, how can you even control that? That seems like something you just enter into naturally because you're sad.
Yeah,
I know, right? Yeah, it's interesting. Like, we can look back in the 1800s and look at the Victorians with their mourning customs, and there's you talked about the fashion. Like, there was this scratchy material called crepe, CRAPE, and it was this ugly black fabric that was made to be ugly and made to be scratchy, made to be uncomfortable, and it was actually made out of silk, which is crazy. I don't mean crazy like in a judgmental way. I mean crazy like, wow, that's wild. But yeah, I mean, we look back sort of at what they did, right? As maybe like, wow, shouldn't mourning be just something that grief is something that naturally happens to you, and then you act on it or don't. But then there's another way of looking at it too. A lot of people that I talk to these days who found themselves in mourning, said they might go to the funeral, and then they're expected to go back to work, and then they experience sort of, colleagues and people really not really knowing how to talk with them, or not, feeling uncomfortable around them, not knowing what to say.
I'm always that way. I never know what to say. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right? So you might look at it as now maybe the pendulum has swung so far in the other direction. There are very few dedicated rules of etiquette that we don't know how to act and we don't know how to behave, and it kind of leaves people in mourning kind of at sea.
Yeah, that's true. I want to just remind our listeners, you are Kate Sweeney. Kate has written a book called American Afterlife. As listeners, you'll probably hear her on National Public Radio. She's broadcast out of WABE in Atlanta, which is what explains how come she's so good on this show.
Yeah.
And a fabulous topic that you've come up with, encounters in the customs of mourning. One real quick story I wanted to share with you. I went to a memorial service some years after the person who died, and some balloons were let go, and the group of us was staring up in the sky as the helium balloons went higher and higher and higher. And I remember reading rules of comedy a long time ago because I thought I was going to be a funny guy. And one of the rules said, you never make jokes at a funeral, especially funeral jokes. Well, the balloons got so far away that they started to look like sperm. And I remember thinking that, and I thought, I wonder if I should say it because I see it. So then I took that risk and I said, they look like sperm, and everybody laughed. And I thought, wow, I'm glad it worked. I was glad it was. Got a laugh. Kate, you are a joy to have on the air. Thank you for being on our show. I have a copy of Kate's book. If we have a listener who would like the one I have, you're welcome to it. The rest of us have to go buy it. How do we get the book?
You can get it on Amazon. You can get it sort of all the usual ways. And yeah, American Afterlife, it's University of Georgia Press. Folks can check out my website. Can I give my website on air?
Yes, definitely, yes.
It's AmericanAfterlifeBook.com. But yeah, you can find it all the usual ways. Amazon, your local friendly bookseller, all that stuff.
All right. And is there an audiobook? And if so, you should be the voice.
Oh, thank you so much. Not yet, although you can get it on Kindle or whatever your reader is.
Well, thank you for being on the air with us. To make it easy for our listeners, the website that Kate just mentioned is already on the WOCA.com website. Just go to our guest list and you'll see Kate Sweeney's name and AmericanAfterlifeBook.com typed in there. Thank you, Kate. Thank you for being on our show today.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Fun interview. Serious topic, fun interview.
Yes.
I will take a little break and be right back.
Fox News Radio, I'm Karen McHugh. A South Korean ferry boat sinks off the coast. At least 4 dead, 100 rescued, but more than 300 still missing.
The South Korean Navy, the South Korean Coast Guard are all involved in the rescue and recovery effort. A special dive team has been brought in to try to get into the boat. Even the U.S. Navy is participating.
Jason Struther of Global Radio News in Seoul. Most of the passengers were high schoolers. As unrest grows between Russia and Ukraine, NATO's taking steps to ensure the safety of other European nations.
We have